Stop scrolling. Look at your skin. In 2026, we have filters, ring lights, and 12-step Korean skincare routines designed to achieve that impossible glass skin glow. But in the 1700s, beauty didn't come from a sterile bottle of niacinamide. It came from a bucket of pure, unadulterated lead. Welcome to the era of Venetian Ceruse, the most prestigious poison in human history. To be elite in the Enlightenment wasn't about health, it was about the ghostly aesthetic. We are talking about a society so terrified of the sun, the marker of the laboring peasant, that they were willing to paint their faces with a literal neurotoxin. This wasn't just makeup, it was a socio-economic shield. In a world ravaged by smallpox, where every face was a map of scars, craters, and tragedy, lead white was the ultimate reset button. It provided an opaque, marble-like finish that no other substance on Earth could replicate. It turned flesh into porcelain, humans into statues, and breathing women into walking monuments of wealth. But as the Enlightenment philosophers debated human rights in the grand salons of Paris, the women sitting beside them were slowly rotting from the outside in. This is the Instagram face of the 18th century. But the subscription fee wasn't $10 a month. It was your central nervous system, your sanity, and ultimately your life. They called it the bloom of youth, but in reality it was the frost of the grave. Every application was a layer of silence over a scream. You see, the whiter you were, the further you were from the dirt of the fields, but the closer you were to the dirt of the cemetery. The aristocracy had struck a bargain with the devil of chemistry. They wanted to look like gods, immortal, frozen, and bloodless, and the lead was more than happy to oblige. It gave them that ethereal radiance, that shimmering, pearlescent sheen that caught the candlelight in the ballroom. But beneath that glow, a chemical war was being waged against their very DNA. The hidden cost of beauty was being recorded, and the interest rate was lethal. By the time you realized you were being poisoned, you were already a masterpiece of decay. This is the lethal paradox of the Enlightenment, a quest for light that led directly into the darkest corners of human vanity. The porcelain face was a mask, and behind that mask, the skull was already waiting to claim its prize. Welcome to the first chapter of our lethal investigation. Let's talk about the alchemy of the abject. How do you create the world's most coveted pigment? You don't find it in a flower, you birth it in a pile of shit. The Dutch process was a masterpiece of industrial disgust. Imagine the scene, thousands of clay pots lined up in a massive shed. You take strips of pure lead, curl them into coils, and place them in these pots above a reservoir of strong vinegar. But here is the secret ingredient. You bury thousands of these pots under mountains of steaming, fermenting horse manure. For 3 long months, the heat from the rotting dung accelerates a terrifying chemical reaction. The acetic acid vapors from the vinegar slowly corrode the lead, while the carbon dioxide gas released by the manure transforms that corrosion into lead carbonate. When the workers finally dug those pots out, they didn't find filth. They found snow, pure, brilliant, heavy, opaque flakes of white lead. It is the ultimate irony of history. The most pure and aristocratic color on Earth was literally generated by the bowels of a horse. Why lead? Why not flour or chalk or zinc? Because lead has a high refractive index. It doesn't just sit on your skin, it plays with light. It creates a glow that seems to come from within the flesh itself. It is incredibly heavy, so it hangs on the skin like a second face, smoothing out every wrinkle, every pore, and every scar with a waxy, seamless perfection. But the chemistry didn't stop at the surface. Lead is a biological mimic. It is a master of disguise. Because its atomic structure is similar to calcium, your body welcomes it. It opens the biological gates, thinking it's receiving a vital mineral, and lets the poison march straight into your bloodstream, your bones, and your brain. Once inside, the lead begins to dismantle you from the molecular level. It interferes with enzyme production, it blocks oxygen transport, and it begins to settle in your skeletal structure like a permanent, toxic resident. The workers who harvested this white gold were the first to know the truth. They suffered from the dangles, a condition where their wrists would go limp because the lead had destroyed the nerves controlling their hands. But the aristocrats in London and Versailles didn't care about the workers. They only cared about the finish. They wanted that porcelain look, no matter the cost. They were applying layers of horse dung-borne toxicity directly onto their open pores every single morning. And as the lead sat on the skin, it began to react with the natural oils and acids of the human body. It wasn't just a covering, it was an invasion. The more they applied, the more the lead stayed, building up in their tissues until their very breath began to smell like metal. This was the alchemy of corrosion, turning living tissue into a dead, white monument. They were becoming statues while they were still alive, unaware that the foundation of their beauty was built on a pile of fermenting filth and a chemical lie that would eventually collapse their entire world. The horror of the deadly white began with a paradox so cruel it feels like a dark comedy. You used ceruse to hide a blemish, but the ceruse caused a blemish 10 times worse. This is what I call the vicious cycle of the mask. As the lead molecules penetrated the dermis, they began to systematically kill the very cells they were meant to beautify. Your skin, deprived of oxygen and poisoned by metal, would start to shrivel. It would lose its elasticity and turn a sickly, bruised yellow, the color of an old bruise. Then came the lead palsy. Deep, weeping sores would erupt across the forehead, the cheeks, and the chin. These weren't just pimples, they were necrotic lesions. And what was the 18th century solution to a face full of sores? Apply more lead. You needed an even thicker layer of white paint to hide the decay caused by the previous layer. You weren't just wearing makeup anymore. You were building a chemical sarcophagus on your own face. The mask became permanent. You couldn't wash it off because what lay beneath was too terrifying to show. You were trapped in a prison of your own making, a shell of white lead hiding a landscape of rotting flesh. But the surface was just the beginning. By the time a socialite reached her mid-20s, the saturnine symptoms would take full control. Lead has a specific affinity for the soft tissues of the mouth. Your teeth would begin to blacken at the roots. Your gums would recede and turn a dark, bluish purple, a telltale sign known as the Burton line. Your teeth would loosen in their sockets and eventually fall out, leaving you with a sunken, skeletal jaw at an age when you should have been in your prime. Your breath would carry the metallic, cloying stench of internal decay, the smell of a body rotting from the inside. And then came the colica pictonum, the lead colic. These were explosive, agonizing abdominal cramps that felt like a hot iron was being twisted in your intestines. The pain was so intense it could leave a person paralyzed, screaming for days on end as their digestive system simply stopped working. But even that wasn't the final stage. The true tragedy was the assault on the mind. Lead is neurotoxic. It crosses the blood-brain barrier with terrifying ease. Once inside the cranium, it causes the brain tissue to swell, a condition called cerebral edema. The grand aristocratic salons of Europe were filled with women and men, suffering from the lead tremors. Their hands would shake so violently they couldn't hold a teacup. They suffered from extreme irritability, chronic headaches, and sudden, inexplicable bouts of violent insanity. They were losing their cognitive functions, their memories, and their personalities, all while staring into a mirror and applying another layer of bloom of youth. They were trading their souls for a marble finish. They were becoming hollow versions of themselves, their brains literally shrinking as the lead replaced the vital minerals necessary for thought. The hidden cost was no longer just a metaphor. It was a physical reality etched into their bones. Every hour of being admired in the ballroom was being paid for with a decade of neurological decline. They were walking chemical reactions, ticking time bombs of heavy metal toxicity, wandering through palaces of gold and silk while their internal organs were turning to stone. This was the true price of the porcelain face, a life of silent, agonizing rot, hidden behind a shimmering wall of white lead that promised eternal beauty but delivered only a slow, agonizing, and very public death. They were the living dead, ghosts in their own homes, haunted by the very reflection they had worked so hard to perfect. Meet Maria Gunning, the Countess of Coventry. If you want to understand the true power of this addiction, you have to look at her life and her horrific end. Maria was the it girl of the 1750s. She and her sister were so famous for their beauty that they couldn't walk down a street in London without a military escort to protect them from rioting fans. Maria was the queen of the porcelain look. She was completely addicted to Venetian Ceruse. She believed that her beauty was her only currency, and she spent it all on lead. Her husband, Lord Coventry, was one of the few who realized the danger. There are famous accounts of him chasing her around the dinner table at parties, trying to scrub the white paint off her face with a damp napkin in front of their guests. He pleaded with her. He begged her to stop, but Maria was terrified of being plain. She was terrified of the tiny scars and the sallow skin that the lead was already creating. To her, being average was a fate worse than death. In 1760, at the age of only 27, Maria Gunning became the first officially recorded victim of cosmetics in British history. Her death was not quick, and it was certainly not beautiful. Her blood was so saturated with lead that her entire biological system simply collapsed. Her skin, which had been the envy of all Europe, turned into a blackened, peeling ruin. She died in a darkened room, refusing to let anyone see the angel she had become. The angel of the age had been transformed into a toxic mess. But did the beauty industry stop? Did they pull the lead off the shelves? Absolutely not. Instead, they saw a market opportunity. They realized that if the elite were dying for this look, the middle class would be willing to pay for it too. They rebranded the poison. They gave it poetic names like the Bloom of Youth or Laird's Enamel of Venus. They marketed it as safe and natural, even as they kept the lead as the primary ingredient. They moved from the grand palaces to the local apothecaries, selling the promise of aristocracy to every shopkeeper's daughter and every young maid, knowing full well that they were selling a death sentence in a porcelain jar. They capitalized on the tragedy of Maria Gunning to fuel a new wave of consumption. The debt wasn't just Maria's. It was now being distributed to the entire population. The lead didn't care about your title, it only cared about your vanity, and business was booming. We look back from 2026 and we laugh at the stupid aristocrats and their manure-born makeup. We think we are superior because we know the periodic table. But are we really any different? Today, the deadly white hasn't disappeared, it has simply evolved. Look at the massive, unregulated skin bleaching markets across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, where mercury, an even more potent neurotoxin than lead, is the primary ingredient in whitening creams. Look at the forever chemicals, PFAS, in your waterproof mascara and long-wear lipsticks that stay in your bloodstream for decades, slowly disrupting your hormones. We are still obsessed with the perfect, poreless face, and we are still willing to strike a bargain with the chemical devil for it. The chemistry has changed, but the human psyche remains exactly the same. We fear the imperfection of being a living, breathing, aging human more than the perfection of being a beautiful corpse. We are still paying the invisible debt. We are still trading our long-term health for a short-term glow. Next time you apply that miracle cream that promises a ghostly radiance or a 24-hour mask of perfection, look a little closer in the mirror. Is that a genuine glow, or is it the first sign of the debt coming due? Are you wearing the makeup, or is the makeup wearing you? Welcome back to the age of deadly white. The colors are brighter, the marketing is slicker, but the skull beneath the skin is still waiting for its payment. Stay beautiful, stay toxic, and remember, the ghost in the mirror might be yours. I'll see you in the next investigation.